Good afternoon from Berlin, Germany. Good morning in the Western Hemisphere. Good evening in Asia. Thank you for joining us for the second day of the Schiller Institute's two-day international virtual conference titled "There Can Be No Peace Without Bankrupting the Dying Transatlantic Financial System." My name is Stephan Ossenkopp. I will be moderating panel 3 and the discussion that will follow. The panel you are about to hear from consists of some outstanding scientists, experts in their fields who will speak on the topic of principles of science for durable economic progress. I will introduce them as soon as they take the virtual podium. Now, the purpose of this series of worldwide events is to ensure a rational approach to today's existential crisis of mankind, many aspects of which have been discussed in the previous two panels, which you should definitely watch if you have not already done so. Please participate actively in this process. First, you can email your questions to the panelists at questions@schillerinstitute.org. That is questions@schillerinstitute.org. They will be taken up by me in the extensive Q&A session after the presentations. And second, become a member of the Schiller Institute. We are an open network that welcomes members from all over the world and from all walks of life. Before we begin, I would like to address you with my own remarks. Because this morning the news said Germany, nominally one of the most advanced industrialized countries, will soon be rationing natural gas, according to the Ministry of Economics. Households and industry will receive instructions on when to heat and when to produce. This is a novelty and will be a shock to people, not only in Germany. So while people are encouraged to put their money into the markets and trade stocks with their cell phones, they are supposed to sit at home, be unemployed and freeze for the greater good, to punish Russia and save democracy. This is a system at a dead end. Speaking of financial markets, most so-called economic news today consists of some reporters standing in a trading floor trying to find explanations for why the charts behind them are moving in one direction or another and why traders are happy or unhappy. I would like to illustrate this point a bit further with an example from a very popular movie some years ago, The Wolf of Wall Street. In one scene, a cocaine-sniffing and martini-sipping stockbroker said the following: "Rule number 1 on Wall Street: nobody, not even Warren Buffett, knows whether a stock is going up, down, sideways, or is going in circles. Least of all us, stockbrokers. It's all a fugazi. You know what fugazi is? It's a fake. It's fairy dust. Doesn't exist. It's not matter. It's not in the elemental charts. It's not real." What passes for economics today, or any science at all, is often fugazi and fairy dust. The numbers are distorted to fit a political purpose, a narrative. What is this narrative? That humans are destroying a mythical balance of nature? That humans' use of resources to improve their standard of living would amount to a crime against nature, a nature that is deified and made untouchable? So now we are supposed to trade our hard-earned income for fairy dust, while at the same time our outdated bridges are collapsing under our feet, fuel and healthcare are scarce and often unaffordable, and we are supposed to feel guilty about heating our homes or eating a steak? This is absurd. Of course, this has a long history going back to the British Empire's willing stooge, Thomas Robert Malthus, and his idea that resources are fixed and the human population must be adjusted to them in numbers, not only in numbers, but also in class. The British eugenics societies long held the pseudoscientific view that the lower classes and non-white races, as they said, were essentially worthless and could basically be treated as disposables. They even put a price tag on babies. This is real. Did you know that John Maynard Keynes was the treasurer of the Cambridge University's Eugenics Society? Today, that role is assigned to climate alarmist activists and their fugazi science, who merely cite and repeat catchphrases, intimidate the public with fears and doubts, and threaten them by declaring people the problem and diverting attention from their own atrocities by depriving people of basic economic goods such as adequate and affordable energy, drinking water, housing, meaningful education, and other things that make it possible to live with dignity. Current events clearly show that this is not a distant phenomenon or an abstract threat to our lives. It is suddenly very real, and this is our system. It has nothing to do with the developments in Ukraine in particular. The current Western elites want to maintain their fairy dust system that has brought them status, wealth, and influence, instead of moving to an economic system that operates according to physical laws and the laws of technological progress. The eminent economist Lyndon LaRouche, from whom we have heard many excerpts in the recent panels, is a pioneer for a national as well as a global economic system based on physical laws whose cause and effect can be demonstrated. Based on these laws, real projections and forecasts can be made of what means will improve a population's standard of living and how and over what period of time. Mr. LaRouche has left a remarkable number of studies, now compiled in volumes of his collected works, and if you have not already done so, I can only recommend strongly that you get a copy of the first volumes now and study it for yourself. Large-scale intellectual improvement is the best weapon we have against neo-Malthusian oligarchs. Now, I would like to give an example of a country that has worked its way from an almost impossible situation up to a lasting improvement and prosperity. China. Now, China is working consistently to increase the share of nuclear fission energy and to master thermonuclear fusion in a widely applicable way by 2035. Incidentally, the same is true in Russia, where the state-owned nuclear energy company Rosatom has pledged to meet 85% of national energy consumption through nuclear power by the end of the century. President Putin has rightly criticized the West's green agenda and green financing, which deliberately diverts investments away from fossil fuels, creating artificial shortages and price inflation. Now, how did China manage to do that? The great reformer Deng Xiaoping said, "Our country wants to catch up with the most developed countries in the world. What should we do first? I believe we must first deal with science and education." End of quote, he said in a speech on August the 8th, 1977. And he continued, "The progress of scientific research in our country depends on the availability of skilled workers. We must do a good job in education because scientific research depends on this field for its supply of young professionals." Quote end. Back then, 45 years ago, in a very poor China, it was bold to imagine such a future. At the time, the odds were stacked against China. In 1977, there were 1.2 million scientific researchers in the United States, about 900,000 to 1 million in the Soviet Union, but only about 200,000 in China. But China could harness these forces, as Deng explained, in a unified and a rational manner. Today, China operates about half of the world's high-speed fleets domestically, high-speed rail fleets. The entire European continent, just over a third. The mighty USA is absurdly at the bottom of the table with countries such as Turkey and Saudi Arabia. In China, a systematically built high-speed rail network of over 40,000 kilometers has linked hundreds of modern cities. It also recently unveiled a Chinese prototype maglev train that is expected to reach speeds of up to 620 kilometers per hour. It uses high-temperature superconductors in the vehicle and permanent magnets in the tracks. In January of this year, China's State Council published a paper entitled "China's Space Program, a Perspective for 2022. The mission and vision of China's space activities are to, quote, expand humanity's understanding of the Earth and the cosmos, meet the requirements of economic, scientific, and technological development, national security, and social progress, and raise the scientific and cultural level of the Chinese people. Quote end. The Space Lab modules Wentian and Mengtian will dock with the Chinese space station this year. Wentian will focus on research in life sciences, which is the growth, development, genetics, and aging of various types of plants, minerals, and microorganisms under space conditions. And the Mengtian will focus on research in fluid physics, materials science, combustion science, basic physics, and space technology. Furthermore, a roadmap for construction of the lunar base by 2035 was presented recently. A guidance document was issued jointly by Chinese and Russian space agencies. According to the document, the physics, the chemistry, and geology of the moon will be studied to the point that resources can be made available for the long-term survival of humans, who would form the first human extraterrestrial colony with a lunar economy. So the West, instead of freezing for human rights, should cooperate with this amazing perspective. We have to blow away the fairy dust economy, Fugazi science, and get back to the real scientific base, which once made possible our industrialization and advances in healthcare, our food self-sufficiency, and our excitement about the accomplishments of the creative human mind. This is the genuinely natural way of doing things in a human way. So without further ado, I would like to introduce the first speaker of today, Jason Ross from the United States, who is the Secretary-Treasurer of the LaRouche organization and a science advisor to Lyndon LaRouche. His presentation is called Vernadsky and LaRouche, Arrow of Economic Time.
There exists a profound coherence between the economic and scientific ideas developed by Lyndon LaRouche and the concepts of the biosphere and noosphere as developed by Vladimir Vernadsky, the great Russian scientist of Ukrainian heritage. This connection is of profound importance today for countering the Malthusian green suicide cult and for charting a course of economic growth to completely eliminate poverty and increase economic output by an order of magnitude. Let's dive in. Lyndon LaRouche spoke of the source of value in an economy lying not in money, but also not in material production itself. The source of economic value is the ability of human beings to make discoveries of universal principle and implement those discoveries socially to achieve an increase in our power over nature. This is measured as an increase in what could be called the carrying capacity, if we were animals, but is better described as the potential population density of the human species. It is also measured in an increase in the density of application of energy in human economy, what LaRouche calls energy flux density. These specifically human creative powers are the basis of economic progress and express something about the organization of the universe. To see that more clearly, let me bring in the distinctions Vernadsky made between three phase spaces: the abiotic, the biological, and the cognitive. These are phase spaces that include their own proper principles. The biosphere is not only living matter itself, it extends into the crust of the earth and to the limits of its atmosphere by virtue of the action of life to change the chemical composition of the lithosphere. The noosphere is the human race and our reshaping of the earth and beyond. Biology has had an increasingly powerful impact on the lithosphere, and human cognition has grown ever more profoundly to have an increasingly powerful impact. There is, though, a quasi-religious belief that biology must be nothing more than physics, and that cognition is at its foundation a biological process. But this reductionism does not work. Music is conveyed with notes, but not contained within them. Ideas are conveyed with words, but are not purely the words themselves. The process of discovery is inseparable from knowledge. Biology follows laws of physics, but is not fully explained by them. Cognition occurs in a biological substrate and is affected by that biology, but is not only biological. To better understand the difference between these phase spaces and the uniqueness of the human one, we'll focus on one particular example, the arrow of time. Why does time flow in one direction and not the other? Let's start with a similar example in geometry, the difference between left and right. In Euclidean geometry, there is no directly statable difference between left and right. They are simply opposites. You can't define left in a purely geometric way. That is, without referring to which side of the body the heart is located on, for example. If you stick only with geometry, they're only opposites. But in biological space, there are many molecules that exist as mirror images of each other, called enantiomers. These are stereoisomers. Amino acids, with one exception, for example, exist as one of these chiral forms, but not the other. Biological processes distinguish between left and right-handed molecules, even if geometry cannot, and even if abiotic chemical processes make no distinction. Here, left and right most certainly do differ in a biological sense. So now let's look at the past and the future. Starting in the abiotic. In the abiotic world, the dynamic physical laws that we have make no direction of time. Time passes, but the formulas work exactly the same when they move to the future or to the past. If you have a differential expression for the evolution of some physical system, does it matter whether dt is positive or negative? We can run our projections forwards or back. But there do exist thermodynamic laws of physics that have a direction in time. That time is related to what is called entropy, a measure of the amount of energy unable to do work, a measure of disorder. These relate to the flow of heat from higher to lower temperatures. So let's take an example. If I played in reverse a video of planets orbiting some other star, you wouldn't know that the video is going forward or backward. You wouldn't know it's in reverse. But if I showed you in reverse a video of an ice cube melting in a cup of tea, you'd know that it was backwards if you saw that in reverse. A cup of tea doesn't get hotter while spontaneously forming an ice cube. Briefly, under these thermodynamic entropic laws, the direction is towards states which have more ways of being. There are more ways to have a warm cup of tea than a hot cup with an ice cube. There are more ways to have air spread around a room than there are ways of having it all condensed in a bottle in the corner of the room. If you open the tank, air would come out. It wouldn't go into the bottle. This is the direction of time in the abiotic in a very brief nutshell. Now, in biology, there are several types of time. There is metabolic time. Think of just a few hours. You eat food, you move your body, you excrete waste, you breathe in oxygen, you breathe out CO2. There is generational time, which is the time of reproduction. And there's evolutionary time, when we think about tens of millions of years. The direction is clear. As one example, over generational time, trees can move across a landscape, even though an individual tree doesn't walk during metabolic time. But as it reproduces, it spreads. Over evolutionary time, life doesn't just change. It's not just different. It advances. And this can be measured in, for example, the number of elements used by life. This can be measured by the flow of material and of energy. The energy flux density of life increases. As an example, mammals use more energy than reptiles per body mass, and especially per generational time. And mammals can have more specialized biological processes due to the fact that we have a controlled temperature. We're warm-blooded, unlike a reptile whose temperature varies much more. Another biological example over evolutionary time, a process called cephalization, which really just means the formation of a head. This has drawn life towards a concentration of nervous processes in one place. We have senses, we have a brain, etc. And these advances, these are just a few examples, have overall allowed life to exert an increasingly powerful effect on the chemistry of our planet. If we look at the arrow of evolutionary time, the tendency is not towards states of greater probability, as it was in the abiotic, but towards states of absolute impossibility. This is the opposite of entropy for giving a direction to the arrow of time in biology. So evolution has drawn life towards new Let's call them biological technologies. The chemotrophs, living off of sulfur emitted by hot vents in the ocean floor, very early life, hypothesized to be having existed for quite some time. These creatures cannot photosynthesize, they don't use light. But now, with the advent of photosynthesis, we have an atmosphere that is 1/5 oxygen. Life's development of photosynthesis isn't in the direction of a greater probability of these deep-sea chemotrophs, but is the creation of a new technology, a new way of generating energy that was impossible for the previous level of life, the previous platform. With photosynthesis, the potential population density of life on the planet soared. In life, past and future are not just opposites, like left and right in Euclidean space, or a positive or negative dt in dynamical processes, in dynamical physics. For life, the future reaches states that the past never could have. Let's apply this to cognitive time. For us, think through the difference in your experience of past and future, and now. Can you remember the future? Can you change the past? What is now in your experience? Do rocks have a now? If there weren't people here expressing our free will, how would some then in physics differ from now? What makes this moment different from another? Does a rock know the difference between now and 10 minutes ago? A new aspect of time in this phase space. A few other parallels. Life has become increasingly independent of its surroundings. Life has increasingly shaped its surroundings, the biosphere. We bring into being new synthetic environments through the infrastructure platforms that we create. And this is how Lyndon LaRouche saw economic infrastructure, not as a collection of pieces of rail or roadway or power lines, but as representing as a whole a certain level of technological understanding and of social direction in implementing it. An economic platform changes the physical economic space in which economic processes unfold. A difference between us and life over evolutionary time would be that, unlike all other life, we create these seismic shifts, these epochal changes in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, when a fundamental discovery is born or communicated. We embody in our minds a process that takes the mere biosphere millions of years, and we are endowed with a now that allows us to willfully change the future, and also the past, by drawing meaning from it. That process of change, that is the truest substance of the universe. We start with what we see in our cognition, not from the abiotic. So, in improving our economic abilities, by increasing our power over nature, we use more energy, more resources per person, and that is good. We also create more resources per person. We create energy. The laws of thermodynamics do not apply to the human economy as a whole. The Malthusian green cult believes in an entropic world in which fixed resources are consumed. They say that progress and development must be stopped. But this is unnatural. This goes against the development of the arrow of evolutionary time and of cognitive time. I conclude. We have a role as the only known form of cognitive life in this universe to expand the process of development initiated by the abiotic universe, the formation of the solar system, then the development of the biosphere. We have an obligation to create a more prosperous, joyful, beautiful, and purpose-filled human society. Such efforts will bring a measure of justice to the past and the future of the lives of Lyndon LaRouche, Vladimir Vernadsky, among the billions of people who have lived and who are yet to be born. Anti-entropy, growth, is our mission as the human species. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jason. Very challenging philosophically also. Now I want to bring in another scientist from Italy. He was until recently the professor of physical chemistry at the University of Modena, and he has been He has a PhD in chemical physics from the University of Rochester in New York, and is the author of many scientific papers and books on theoretical chemistry and chemical physics. He joins us from Italy, Francesco Battaglia, and his presentation is called The Fraud of Climate Energy Transition.
Buongiorno. Allora,
Good morning.
Scelte di politica energetica.
On the basis of the choices of energy policy chosen by Europe and also the United States, they assume that there is a climate emergency that has to be fought, caused by fossil fuels and CO2 emissions, and they must be reduced to zero. And we must produce energy in other ways, specifically using so-called renewables for generating electricity, but also reducing emissions from car engines, the transportation sector, heating, lighting, essentially everything as conceived by those who want this energy transition. Specifically, wind and solar panels. Now, the fact that there is no climate emergency has been brought up many times. This pamphlet, showed here, contains a petition sent to the Secretary of the United Nations by 1,000 scientists. The first signatory was a Nobel laureate in physics, Ivar Jaber. Of course, this fell on deaf ears. Now let's look at why reducing CO2 emissions is not only undesirable, but also impossible. The year 2021 was not the first time an attempt was made to reduce CO2 emissions. In fact, the world's big names have already met 26 times, most recently in Glasgow last year. This year they will meet in Egypt in November for the 27th time, which shows they failed 26 times. On other occasions, they actually tried to sign agreements, most notably the Kyoto Protocol and the European Union's 2020 package. The Kyoto Protocol, which came into force in 2003, stipulated that emissions should be reduced by 6% by 2012. And the 2020 package stipulated that by 2012, which is the date of expiration of the Kyoto Protocol, emissions should have been reduced by 20% from 1990 levels. In reality, emissions increased by 40%. Observing that emissions were rising in spite of every Kyoto agreement, in 2008, the European Union launched this 2020 package, proposing that by 2020, they would reduce emissions by 20% from 1990 levels. But this curve that you see in front of you keeps going up, and emissions are 60% higher. It is a fact that CO2 emissions have been rising relentlessly for 150 years. The Green New Deal, or the Fit for 55, would like to reduce emissions and bring them to zero over the next 30 years. A leap that will absolutely not happen. Rather the contrary, emissions will continue to increase simply because abandoning fossil fuels is technically inconceivable and impossible. Why is it technically impossible to abandon fossil fuels? Of course, the other countries in the world know this perfectly well. The European Union, which contributes only 9% to world emissions, if the EU were to actually zero out its emissions, this would in fact not contribute anything to the alleged climate impact. I repeat, this would have no effect on the presumed climate impact. Because 91% of the rest of the world's emissions will not be reduced. In fact, they will increase, given the energy policy programs of both China and India. So what's the point? The point you have to understand is that our civilization, our society, differs from past civilizations in one very specific thing, which is that we have made available to all abundant and cheap energy for several tens of thousands of years until 200 years ago. We got 100% of our energy from the sun. Today, solar energy, as we can see, even if we include hydroelectricity, which is also solar energy, contributes less than 10%. So solar energy is without question the energy of the past. 85% of our energy today comes from fossil fuels, add 5% from nuclear to that 85%, and we have 90% of our technology from our technologies, which are not solar energy. They are not in the renewable energy pool. Now, why did I say it is technically impossible to make this coveted energy transition? The reason lies mainly in this graph, which has the same trend. It is for Italy, but the graph for the United Kingdom and other advanced countries is similar. It represents the consumption of electricity over a 24-hour period. As can be seen, Italy always consumes 30 gigawatts of electricity. However, in the hours between 8 in the morning and 8 in the evening, this rate of consumption increases and reaches maximum peaks of 60 gigawatts at 7 in the evening. Now, at 7 o'clock in the evening, it's dark. Therefore, photovoltaic panels being installed on all city roofs actually count for zero. As for the wind, we can't assume the wind will blow at 7 o'clock in the evening just because we want it to. Then, in order to meet the maximum peak electricity, and we're imagining a world that would like to go all electric, to meet this maximum peak, we would need sufficient conventional plants to guarantee the electricity to meet this demand. And what kind of conventional plants? The ones that produce power on user demand. Do we need more electricity? We fire up the coal plants, the natural gas plants, nuclear plants. We burn more coal, more gas, or more uranium, depending on the demand. I have simplified things slightly, but basically that's the way it is. It doesn't apply to nuclear power, which is always on, but gas turbines can be turned on quickly on demand at peak hours. As an alternative to gas turbines, there is hydroelectricity, the only renewable source that technically has any validity. Why? Because hydropower also produces electricity on demand. I drop water on the turbine so that the gravitational potential energy at height becomes kinetic energy when it falls on the turbines and is transformed into electricity. That's the point. So conventional technologies are absolutely irreplaceable. Hydropower, of course, has a constraint. The constraint is that it depends on reservoirs. In the Italian province of Puglia, there are no hydropower plants, but we do have them in Trentino Alto Adige, because a country like Italy can rely on hydropower for around 15 to 20% of its needs. The rest has to be either nuclear or coal or gas. And this is true also for other countries. Here is the load curve of the United Kingdom, which has the same pattern. At 7 o'clock in the evening is the peak of maximum consumption. Now, how about the world? What does Italy do? What would Europe like to do? How does the world produce its electricity? Mainly 34 to 35% from coal. What about Italy? Italy wants to stop coal altogether. In fact, I think the president of Enel, in a recent speech, said he wants to close all our coal plants and cover the areas with solar panels. Just plain crazy. And what about the rest of the world? What do they do? The world relies a little too much on natural gas. Too much because it would be better to rely mainly on coal and nuclear. This is a graph for world energy production. If we look at Europe, nuclear is first and coal is second. In the United States, coal is first and nuclear is second. However, let's look at the situation in the world as a whole. Coal is first, natural gas, I repeat, there's too much dependence on natural gas for generating electricity. Natural gas should be used for the auto industry. And as I said earlier, we should use coal, nuclear, and to the extent possible, hydro for generating electricity, and natural gas only slightly for generating electricity, say 5 to 10%, not the 25% that is currently the case in the world. No more than 5% to meet peak demand, since gas turbines turn on quickly. However, unlike the rest of the world, Italy has relied almost entirely on natural gas. Much worse than the world has. Almost half of its electricity needs are met by natural gas. How did this ever happen? Because Italy said no to nuclear power. We produce 0% nuclear. If we include consumption, we would be at minus 15%, because Italy imports nuclear power from France. We have a contract to import 6 gigawatts. We have reduced nuclear to a new import commodity. With coal, we're being picky. We want to shut it down. So coal is out, nuclear is out, and we are doing as much as we can with hydro. So we've tied ourselves hand and foot to suppliers of natural gas, specifically Russia, which has rightly supplied us with its natural gas at, shall we say, reasonable prices. We have committed the further insanity of going to war with Russia for no reason at all. The Russian-Ukrainian issue is an issue between Russia and Ukraine. Getting entangled with supplying weapons to one of the two contenders, first of all, was foolish because it does not take into account the claims of either side, particularly Russia, which can also be understood as legitimate claims if one analyzes them carefully. Secondly, we have taken ourselves out as a potential peacemaker, an arbiter. And so this war that Russia is fighting in Ukraine with all reasonable motives. The main motives being that Russia did not want to have NATO missiles on its borders, which is reasonable. Just like in 1962, when Kennedy could not tolerate Soviet missiles on its borders, specifically just off Florida and Cuba. And that little conflict, which was not an armed conflict, Khrushchev and Kennedy resolved it within a week. Khrushchev very reasonably turned around his ships carrying missile parts to be assembled in Cuba. And shortly after, in return, the United States removed its missiles from Turkey. Today, such a peaceful solution, with both sides compromising, has been obviated by choices which, in my view, are tinged with evil. My position from this point of view is the same as that of Pope Francis. As a result, we now have a big problem, besides having to be reconciled with Russia, which cannot be guaranteed without Russian natural gas, either directly or by using intermediaries. About this, there is no doubt. But the other problem is that the expenditures, the economic investments we are making into technologies that are, as we say in Italian, gimmicky, losers, interruptible, specifically wind and solar panels, will put our backs against the wall. While energy prices increase, the which will make us less competitive with countries that have cheaper energy. Let me stop here to leave time for questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Battaglia from Italy. I was just informed by the technical staff that we do have a problem with the Zoom meeting. We will now, as I'm speaking, restart Zoom for your convenience so that you can rejoin. We're very sorry about the technical hiccup we had, but we're working it out. So if you are now, give it a couple of seconds so that we can restart our Zoom session for those who need translation into German and into Spanish. That's very important. So our technical people will restart it and you can rejoin it, and you'll be able to hear the coming presentations in full quality with translation as we had it yesterday, of course. So let's, okay, that was Professor Battaglia, a recently retired professor from the Department of Physical Chemistry at the University of Modena. And he gave us a very stark picture that is shaping the almost existential crisis of Europe's energy system, which is dominated by a complete ideology, green ideology, which will lead us into a dark age if we don't reverse the trend. So next, we will have Dr. Ed Calabrese from the United States of America. He's a professor of environmental health sciences at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. And he has been an author of thousands of eminent scholarly journals, articles, wrote more than 10 books. And the recent one he wrote along with his co-editor, Mark Mattson, and it's called Hormesis, a revolution in biology, toxicology, and medicine, Real science disproves the linear non-threshold LNT radiation myth. So I hope we have his presentation now ready.
Thank you very much, Dr. Calabrese, for giving us your time and the opportunity to talk with you. And so just to give a sense to the audience, what is the LNT model? And what was your research concerning the historical underpinnings of that model and the way we think about it today?
The LNT model, it's a dose response model, very general type of dose response model, and just for the general public, anyways, a dose response model is something that we all experience every single day. It's how much we do something, whether it's exercise or consumption of alcohol or anything. It's just how much do you do, and how does that translate into an effect? And so for example, and it also relates to not just how much, but how quickly you do it. So say, for example, if somebody has a glass of wine and they drink the glass of wine too quickly, they may feel a bit lightheaded very quickly. And that's an example of a dose response and a dose rate response. And it relates to common experiences that we have as to when we do certain activities, we see certain effects, and those are plotted on graphs, and that's kind of the work that pharmacologists and toxicologists and epidemiologists tend to do when they try to figure out dose-response relationships and how drugs or pollutants or anything work on biological systems. So that's the general idea of a dose-response relationship, and it's just kind of something that one learns probably by the time you're 6 years old, except we put numbers around it as we get older and make it a bit more sophisticated. In terms of the commonsensical situation, most people would believe that things tend to act via a threshold. It means that you may have to exceed a certain level of exposure before an effect may become perceptible or measured and or somehow register on whatever scale that you're trying to register it on. And that's how the belief systems tended to work really 120, 150 years ago and moving forward. And then what happened is 1930 or so, by radiation geneticists in this country, they began to look at the effects of radiation and how it may affect the genome differently. And an idea came to happen that in fact that there was no safe level of exposure, that there was no such thing as a threshold, that radiation was really different than chemicals or other things, and that every single exposure that would cause a genetic change was occurred and was not repaired, and that the effects would be cumulative, that they would be irreversible, that they wouldn't be repairable. And when you linked all those three things together, what you ended up getting was a linear dose response. And that linear dose response assumed that any amount of damage, any amount of exposure would cause damage, and ultimately even a single ionization from a single radiation particle could have the potential to cause damage. And what happened over time, and that is that I'd say from about 1930, when this idea was first floated, until let's say the late 1950s, it took about 30 years for this idea to resonate and to grow and to get its following and to take advantage of certain international situations like the atomic bomb, like above ground testing, like fear of radioactive fallout, and ultimately for politicians and scientists and the world community to move from a threshold model to an LNT type of model, mostly on the basis of fear, and ultimately fear has come to drive politicians and others and moving the country forward or backward, however you might want to see how fear deals with our behavior and policies. Well, I'd have to say that my challenging of the belief system of the scientific community, the toxicology community, the radiation community, began probably in a serious vein in the early 1990s. But I really wasn't taken very seriously until probably the early 2000s. But once, what actually happened for me is that if people don't take you seriously, then you don't become the object of a lot of attacks. They tend to people, whoever is, who's ever in the bullseye, they're really, people tend to think that person is significant. If you're not really being attacked, then you probably realize that you're not very significant in the eyes of the opposition. And so I knew that in the 1990s that I was onto something that was exciting and hot, going to be hot. But I knew that I had to do a lot more work to get there, put it that way. And I worked kind of quietly in many ways, and the way a researcher works, basically through playing the game you're supposed to, do your work, publish in articles and so forth. And then what happened for me was a kind of a breakthrough in both positive and negative ways. In 2003, I got a paper published in the journal Nature, and I was put into their publicity package. And I had never published in Nature before, and I had never been in a publicity package before. But wow, I saw what that actually did. And the paper was really dealing with not just an attack on LNT. It was also attacking the threshold model. I was claiming that this phenomenon called hormesis, which is a biphasic dose response, where low doses of harmful things could actually be beneficial, was the dominant, I believe, the dominant dose response model that should be operating in toxicology. And that's really a radical statement. That's saying like the field got everything wrong right from the very beginning. And so, because it was so quirky and so challenging, I think it got the attention of the editorial board at Nature, and they wanted to float the idea, allow me to float the idea. So they gave me, as I was to learn later, because some insider on their editorial board told me that the big fight was over how many words I would be allowed and how many figures. And so they were fighting over 2,500 words or 2 or 3 figures, and they ended up giving me 1,500 words in 1 figure. So that's what I got in my paper. But what happened was when I got into the Nature article and I got into the press package, I ended up getting a lot of publicity, and the publicity was front page articles in multiple newspapers. In my hometown one, you might say the Boston Globe ran one. I got a big story in the Wall Street Journal. U.S. News and World Report did a very big piece, put my picture in there. Eventually, later on, afterwards, Science Journal did a 4-page story with my picture in there as well. Lots of other things happened, all kinds of debates, and so I went from kind of a non-entity into a known commodity, or a new kid on the block, so to speak. And so, but what actually happened after that point was people began to get concerned, because here was somebody who was saying not only was LNT wrong, but in fact in fact, toxic substances at low doses, he's saying that these could produce even beneficial effects. And he must be crazy. I mean, if he's not crazy, he must be dangerous. In any case, you know, he has to be challenged and probably stopped. We'll see how serious he really is. I'd have to tell you that my development in this area really happened, you know, after I was 50 years old. Okay, and I'm very broadly trained. I'm a very traditional person, very traditional scientist, very traditional lab-oriented person, and so I've taken a broad range of courses, and so I'm you know, very old school. I'm very old school when it comes to broadly read, and but also hands-on in a laboratory. So I kind of hopefully, you know, have paid my dues and understand the process and very self-critical. But I'd have to tell you something that was very significant for me that might be very useful for students. And that is that, you know, when I was a young PhD student, there was this thing called current contents. And it was, we'd meet, you know, we'd have a journal club every week, and we'd try to take a look at the most recent paper and see what's happening today. But actually, after I got through graduate school and I started to become a faculty member, you know, you have to keep up on everything. But I actually developed a very inverted way of learning, and that was that when I was to write anything, and I wrote a lot of books and so forth, I instead of looking at what was current, I went down and got the very first thing that was ever written on something, and then got every single thing that happened since that time. And I would never read the most recent article first. I'd read that last. I'd go to the very first thing and I'd read what they discovered. Then I'd try to say, well, what should the next experiment be? And then I'd say, and how would I do it? And then I'd look to see what was done. And most oftentimes, what I thought should have been done, what was never done. And I kept making this inverted, you know, cone step forward, and it changed entirely the way I began to see science. I began to see science as history, and I began to see science as biography. And I'm saying most of our good ideas were lost along the way. Whereas the way science is taught today, in all days, it's a straight line from the beginning to right now. It's a straight line. And actually, it's anything but a straight line. It's a jagged line. There are gaps in it. There's I think the best ideas were never even thought about or followed up on. And yet all we do is we think it's a straight line and we go to the most recent things. And so somehow I picked that up on my own. And this actually is what was at the core of how I believe I've made these historical discoveries on LNT, was just doing something differently and thinking about it very differently than the impatience of scientists today that just have to read what's the most recent thing. I'm all in favor of recent. I look at things every single day, what's happening today, but I don't forget that you really have to go back to the original stuff, and then you track it. And so you have to do twice as much work, but it's synergistically better than if you don't. And so I believe that that's been part of what's led to my you know, lucky discoveries along the way, you might say. It's interesting that you raise that, and in some ways I've had a chance to experience the negative side of that, and built into the positive side of it, because and I'm going to and how quickly areas develop, and I'm just going to give you an analogy. All right, the analogy is I read a book a number of years ago, a goodly number of years ago, and it was looking at, you know, how an idea gets accepted and gets spread through the colony or the society. But in this case, it was anthropologists who were studying 2 colonies of baboons. And they were geographically isolated, and but they knew the social structure from the highest, ranked male to the lowest female baboon in terms of their power structure, right? And so the investigators, they were going to teach the baboons a very new and important way of acquiring food. And they wanted to see how long it would take the idea to be learned and adopted by all the other members of the baboon colony. And so in one case, they took this knowledge and they taught it to the top male, okay, that top male. And it took about 3 hours for all the other baboons to learn, observe, and pick it up and do it, okay? And then they went to the other baboon colony and they taught it to the lowest female. And it took months and months for this great idea to be adopted, okay? And I said, wow, this is amazing. It depends on good idea. It's the same idea, but it depends on who has the idea, how quickly it's picked up. So what's happened with me is this idea of hormesis, radiation hormesis, and the like. And it's a revolutionary idea. And it was back in the 1980s, this big database called Web of Science database had about 10 or 15 citations per year. Now it's 40 years later, and I've been working on this extremely intensely. And it's this past year, the citations have gone now, it took 40 years, but it's over 18,000. So you might say that's an awful lot, but it had really, really slow on the uptake, and it's now going up, quite fast. However, I can assure you that if that I'm the equivalent of the female baboon, the lowest ranked person, okay? I had a great idea, taken me 40 years to get this thing going. If I had been, I'm going to say the dean of the Harvard School of Public Health, or if I had been somebody else of some notable something or other, and they had the idea that I had early on, it would have been revolutionized this world by now. And so I think that one of the big issues here is that there are certain social structures that can accelerate good ideas, and social structures that make it very difficult for ideas to be adopted. And it tells you something about either the political structure, the social structure, or something. But I can tell you my ideas, either because of my low standing in society or whatever else is going on, have taken an awful long time. And but on the positive side, okay, that's the negative side, right? On the positive side, I have believed in my ideas. I actually have believed in my ideas, and I studied them. And I can tell you that I understand what I'm talking about when it comes to my things far better, because I've worked out all kinds of errors, problems, and so forth by myself, with nobody even giving you even a thread of encouragement. They mostly shun you. They reject you. They do all these things. And so eventually, what will happen in this case is that, I know that in fact, I'm being proven, I think, correct over time on these other ideas. And the same thing is true on this LNT thing. In the beginning, when I brought out that Mueller probably lied at his Nobel Prize speech, and that Mueller didn't actually induce gene mutations, and you get hit, and you get bopped on the head, and you get flushed down the toilet, and you get treated with a marginalized scientist. You're kind of a nothing. And then, but eventually, once the name calling is all done, and they really specialize in name calling and other ways to marginalize you. But, I've always taken great solace in the fact that the criticisms that I got was, well, I'm not as smart as Mueller, and I didn't go to an Ivy League school, and I'm a marginalized scientist because I work on this hormesis thing. And I said, well, all those things are true. I said, but would you do me a favor and tell me where my mistake is? Okay, well, then they go back to just recycling, the personal attacks, rather than the issues of science that I would raise. And so you have to listen to what the criticisms are. If the criticisms are just how stupid you are, or the fact that you don't have a Nobel Prize, or the fact that you didn't go to Harvard University, well, all those are true, but that's not the relevant question here. So you have to look at the relevant question. And so there are different ways in which people try to prevent you from going forward and to marginalize you. And you just have to understand what the basis of the arguments should be that are valid, and those arguments which aren't valid. And hopefully people will get around to it. But you have to be strong, and you have to be courageous, and you have to be self-critical. You have to be, you have a lot of critics out there, but the most important critic in your life is, guess who? It has to be you. You have to be your own worst, toughest, most raunchiest, most difficult person to satisfy. And if you can be all those rough, tough things to yourself, the rest of the world's going to seem kind of easy when you face it.
Thank you very much, Professor Calabrese. I think although you were hit on the head and flushed down the toilet, you've made an excellent and inspiring presentation. I think a lot of us are sharing the same sentiment and feelings as Professor Calabrese. I'm informed that Professor Calabrese might not, or may not, or will not be able to be on the question and answers period. But nevertheless, send in your questions. A lot of the presenters will be at the Q&A session, which will begin shortly. We will have 2 more presentations. The next one will be by Professor Sergei Pulinets from Russia. And he's a principal scientific researcher of the Space Research Institute of the Russian Academy of Sciences in Moscow. He has he has more than 40 years experience in space physics and radio physics, physics of the ionosphere, and also geophysics. So please, Professor Pulinets, we are excited to hear what you have to say.
Can you hear me? Hello. Yes. Good afternoon, or for those who in West, it is good morning probably yet. I would like to share with you my ideas about the relationship between the development of science and present state of our society. And probably I will start with similar things that were described in the first presentation about the academician Vernadsky, who I consider that this idea paved the way of what I'm doing now, especially 2 things. He was one of the first scientists which developed the science of the nuclear physics in the field of radium studies. He was director of the Radium Institute in the St. Petersburg, and I am now working with radon, which is daughter product of the radium, and plays very important role on the modification of the lower layer of atmosphere and contributing to the lithosphere-atmosphere ionosphere coupling, which I will describe a little bit later on. And the last thing, it is his ideas of the geospheres interaction, on which our model is based. And one of his very interesting and important ideas, it was idea of noosphere. This term was proposed a little bit earlier by the French scientists Edouard Leroy and priest Pierre Teilhard, but the Professor Vernadsky merit is that it filled this term with a materialistic content, showing the knowing the laws of nature and improving technology begins to exert a decisive influence on the course of processes on the Earth and the near-Earth space, changing them with its activity. But in many countries, and especially in the Western world, there are a little bit primitive understanding of the geospheres interaction. If you look at the right part of the pictures, they only show the biosphere, atmosphere, geosphere, and hydrosphere, forgetting completely about the space effects on our environment, which plays decisive role in development of our nature and society. And the second very important thing, that biosphere, and especially mankind being, is very fragile, because if you look at the left part of the figure, you will see that the position of the biosphere, it is very thin, very skin of our, here you can see skin of life, because these 20 kilometers where the living beings exist is even less than the skin of our body, looking from the perspective of the environment. And we should be very careful to maintain the conditions of our life, do not lose the possibility of the future. And next, you can see that the interaction of the geospheres is much more complex, because we have impact from the above, from the sun, from the galactic cosmic rays, and then energy of the sun activity is transformed into the energy of our magnetosphere, which creates the large number of different currents and fields in our environment, in the ionosphere, in the atmosphere. And many physical events are influenced by the solar activity. For example, the interesting objects like hydropower stations can be influenced by the solar activity. Probably you remember this disaster in Canada in 1989, probably, when the old province Ontario was without electricity during the whole day. From another side, we have influence from the seismic activity on our environment, and this activity is projected not only into the atmosphere, but into the ionosphere and even magnetosphere, and modifies our environment. And we will see this if we look carefully on the global electric circuit where we live. we continuously are inside the global electric circuit, and on the ground surface, the vertical electric field or gradient of the vertical electric field is 100 volts per meter. So between your legs and head, you have nearly 200 volts difference, and this global electric circuit is modified by many factors, by the galactic cosmic rays, by the air pollution, by the natural radioactivity. And for example, the galactic cosmic rays contribute to the formation of the clouds. And so we have relationship between the action of the galactic cosmic rays and our thunderstorm activity. Here you can see the so-called Carnegie curve. It is a UT variation of this electric field on the ground surface. And in the right side, you can see the distribution of the thunderstorm discharges, which are mainly concentrated all over the continents. And in the summer hemisphere, this thunderstorm activity higher than in the lower hemisphere. But what is interesting and very mysterious, that this daily electric field activity has a very large correlation with the global seismic activity. And looking in the cause-effect relationships, we can state that probably the seismic activity controls the thunderstorm activity on our planet. And we can see that mainly the seismic activity happens in the such longitudes when the magnetic field lines from the tail of the magnetosphere are projected on this longitude during nighttime. And you can see the lines of the main tectonic activity for the case when we have daytime in the northern hemisphere and nighttime, not northern, in the western hemisphere, and nighttime in the eastern hemisphere, and all the Asian Pacific part is seismically active, and in the opposite situation, we see the projection of the southern pole and seismic activity in the western hemisphere. And about the action of the galactic cosmic rays, probably nobody heard that the galactic cosmic rays has influence on the formation and amplification of the hurricanes. And I would like to show you the example of the Katrina hurricane. And nobody heard that before the Katrina hurricane, we had effect of the geomagnetic storm, during which we have the so-called Forbush decrease of the galactic cosmic rays flux, what led to the diminish of the air temperature on the altitude of 16 kilometers in the tropopause by nearly 9 degrees of centigrade. And due to this decrease of the temperature of the tropopause, the difference between the temperature on the ground surface or ocean surface and tropopause increased drastically, what led to the vertical turbulence, and vertical convection increased, and this led to development of the Katrina hurricane. And it is not only the one case. This violet picture shows that statistical data for hurricanes with category 5, the most powerful hurricanes in the Atlantic Ocean, made by Mexicans. And you can see that 2 days before the development of hurricanes category 5, we see the decrease of the flux of the galactic cosmic rays. So, to make the progress of science, we should take into account all the things which happens in our environment. I mean the interaction between the geospheres. We should finish the separation between the scientific disciplines, like this one is seismologist, this one is meteorologist, and so on, because all the effects in our environment are concerned in the interaction between different fields of science, different geospheres, and only holistic approach and extended international cooperation will lead to the progress of science. And you can see that during recent years, we observe some slowing down of the science development. Probably it could be attributed to the lesser level of the scientific cooperation. And I would like to show that all the progress of our science was made due to contacts between the scientists of different countries. Here, I would like to show you this young lady who I have discussed during the Reagan time, and she asked me, is Russia is evil empire? I tried to convince her that it is not so. And this small girl, you can see, finally became the famous American astronaut Tammy Jernigan, which has now very important position in the Livermore National Laboratory. Here, our radiophysical studies were progressed in the cooperation. This is a border image from the who was principal designer of the network of the ground-based ionizon called digizones. These scientists are from Kharkov, Ukraine, and is photo taken in the Ukraine. Here is cooperation between Polish scientists, Taiwan, Russia, and also Polish, it is Copernic. And here we had the international project just about the earthquake forecast science, and you can see Italian, France, United States, Russia, Japan. So only in the close cooperation we can reach the real progress in science. And nothing in the science or in human relations can be neglected or eliminated. So you can see it is a portrait of Dostoevsky, which is this mural appeared in March of this year and on the wall of the Italian, one of the university in Italy, which is against the elimination of the Russian culture in the world now. And I would like to finish with some statements which show that we are now in the very dangerous situation, because we see that in the world it is growing the such effects like intolerance, when the one side does not accept arguments of the other side, and even the arguments of other side is correct, they are not accepted because this side does not belong to the first side, and better to have the erroneous but people from your company than the people from other side, which are probably has right opinion. So increase the primitivism, ignorance, when the people do not have enough knowledge in physics, chemistry, geography, so they only want to have what to eat and to reach the prosperity, but they do not think about future, which could be reached only by the development of the science and during cooperation. And this last thing is a moral decline, what leads to the depopulation, degradation of our society, involution, and may lead to the war and humanity extinction. So my appeal that we should cooperate, work together to prevent the humanity extinction. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Pulinets from Moscow, who's a 40-year expert in space science and geophysics. One more technical detail. The Zoom company has told us that they have resolved the problems and you can enter now. It should be fine with the translation. But before I bring up the last presenter, I just wanted to pick up on one of the points Professor Pulinets made in the end, which I think is very relevant, and the Schiller Institute has been dedicated very much to bringing this forward, the dialogue of civilizations. If we compartmentalize science, if we have national interests over the interests of humanity and other such aspects, then we will not get to what the Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the president of the Schiller Institute and founder, called the new paradigm. We need exchange. And I think that a very promising vehicle and platform is not only what the Schiller Institute is doing in pioneering this movement, but also what nations such as, for example, China, which I mentioned in the beginning, is also doing. Their so-called Belt and Road Initiative, or New Silk Road, as it's sometimes known in the West, is exactly, it's not just an economic program. It does have a very strong aspect of cultural dialogue, cultural exchanges, because in the experience of any deep civilization like the Chinese, they know that isolation is the wrong way, and the exchange with other cultures on a fair level and, of course, on an equal level and level of respect is the solution for most of our problems that we do have today. So I want to bring up the last speaker of today, which is William C. Jones from the United States. He is the former EIR White House correspondent. He is also a non-resident scholar of the Renmin University's. It's the Department for Financial Studies, and he has now a presentation called V.I. Vernadsky, Scientific Thought as a Geological Force. Thank you. We're very eager to hear what you have to say.
Let me start by quoting the deceased space engineer and former Peenemünde Kraft Erica, a friend and collaborator with Lyndon LaRouche and Helga Zepp-LaRouche, and a former board member of the Schiller Institute. Erica said, if God wanted man to become a spacefaring species, he would have given him a moon. Erica also talked about what he called the extraterritorial imperative. What kind of imperative was this actually? On the one hand, I think it had to do with man's innate curiosity and desire to know more and to resolve conundrums, to probe the unknown, the moon is close by. It seems as if you could touch it if you had arms long enough. But it was also an imperative for Erica, since the moon also possessed considerable natural resources that would be of importance for life here on Earth. Erica was one of the first to seriously discuss and develop the notion of mining on the moon. He also developed what he called the 3 laws of astronautics, which we see here. 1, nobody and nothing under the natural laws of this universe impose any limitations on man except man himself. Not only the Earth, but the entire solar system and as much of the universe as he can reach under the laws of nature are man's rightful field of activity. By expanding through the universe, man fulfills his destiny as an element of life, endowed with power of reason and the wisdom of the moral law within himself. Similar thoughts had been expressed earlier by the Russian-Ukrainian scientist Vladimir Ivanovich Vernadsky. He may be more familiar to you than Kraft Erica, or he may not be. Aside from Dmitry Mendeleev, scientific breakthroughs by Russian scientists have not been so well known in the West. Few works of Vernadsky's prolific output have been translated, with the first version of his early groundbreaking work, The Biosphere, being an early exception. And yet Vernadsky made major contributions in crystallography, mineralogy, hydrology, cosmochemistry, and meteorology, among others. He can well be considered the founder of the field known as biogeochemistry. That is the study of how living matter transforms the inorganic universe. Here you see his biogeochemistry laboratory in St. Petersburg in the 1930s. He was the first Russian scientist to urge the development of nuclear energy in Russia almost at the turn of the last century, shortly after atomic energy was discovered. Vernadsky was also a historian of science, and his vision of scientific work would have great relevance for scientists today, particularly his understanding of the new role that science must play in economic development from the era that mankind had now entered. Here is the way that Vernadsky viewed things in 1926. There exists in the biosphere a grand geological force, perhaps even cosmic in nature, whose planetary action is not taken into consideration in our concept of the cosmos, that is, in our concepts based on science. This force neither appears as a new special manifestation or form of energy, nor may it simply be an expression of known energies. Nevertheless, the action of that force exerts a profound and powerful influence on the course of the Earth's energetic phenomena, and consequently must undoubtedly have reverberations, albeit less powerful, beyond the Earth's crust in the existence of the planet itself. That force is the intellect of man, directed and organized through the volition of man in his social existence. Vernadsky called this new era that we have entered, where science is primary, the era of the noosphere. Vernadsky was also preeminent organizer of science. In Russia during World War I, he took the initiative to organize the Committee on the Study of the Natural Forces of Russia, which would bring together existing knowledge of strategic war materials and gather new information about Russia's resources. But I would like to focus today on Vernadsky's Ukrainian side, given the events that are going on in that country today. In particular, I would like to upset the apple cart of a myth that the present Ukrainian government is pushing, that they have never been a part of Russian culture and history, except perhaps as victims. Pushkin Street today is now becoming Stephen King Street. Gagarin Street is now Neil Armstrong Street. Tolstoy's War and Peace can no longer be taught in Ukrainian schools because it praised Russia's army in its fight against Napoleon. What a travesty. What a total impoverishment of cultural life for young Ukrainians. And what a distortion of real history. And unfortunately, we in the West have largely been following suit in our restrictions on Russian singers and artists. The St. Petersburg-born Vladimir Vernadsky loved Ukraine. His family had its roots in the Zaporizhia Cossack region of Ukraine. His parents were both born in Kiev. They were fluent in Ukrainian, a language which Vladimir taught himself. His mother sang Ukrainian songs at home, and much of his creative and revolutionary work in the study of living matter was nourished in Ukraine and its flourishing natural endowments. While Ukrainian culture and language was often banned by the Russian Empire, Vernadsky and many other Russians supported Ukraine's desire for autonomy and the rights of its culture to develop. In 1918, Vernadsky, then at his summer home in Poltava in Ukraine, on a sabbatical leave from St. Petersburg due to the Bolshevik Revolution, received an invitation from a Ukrainian colleague to come to Kiev to help organize the intellectual life of the region. Ukraine had been lost to Russia in the peace agreement signed by the Bolshevik government with Germany. Ukraine was thus then under German occupation. But Vernadsky had already participated in many discussions earlier in St. Petersburg with Ukrainian colleagues discussing the possibility of creating a Ukrainian Academy of Sciences as part of the St. Petersburg Academy. So Vernadsky accepted the invitation. He himself had done extensive studies of the history of the Academy movement in France, in America, and in Russia. His view, however, was that in this new era, when scientific thought had become a geological force, a different conception of the Academy was required. It must not simply be a gathering of noted scientists coming together to discuss scientific questions, but rather must serve as the basis of a Manhattan-style mobilization of the entire intellectual forces of the nation to lift the country to a higher level. His proposals envisioned the creation of an autonomously elected academy, which would have the full backing of the government. Under it would be a national library that would accumulate all the available intellectual material vital for the life of the country in all languages: books, manuscripts, musical notes, literary remains of important intellectuals, etc. It must incorporate the works of world culture and be open to the world. At the same time, there must be set up studies of Ukrainian literature and culture and a commission appointed for the creation of a dictionary of the Ukrainian language. The library must be open to all and free of charge. The Academy project would also subsume a national program of education and research, an agronomical institute, a chemical laboratory, an institute for biological studies, a meteorological observatory, a mineralogical museum, and a museum of history. Vernadsky also created an institution like he did in Russia for the study of the productive forces of Ukraine. The proposal for the creation of the Academy was accepted by the government, and Vernadsky was elected its first president. One must keep in mind the instability of the political situation in Ukraine at the time. During the period of the organization of the Academy, namely 1918 to 1920, there were more than 3 governments in Ukraine. When the Germans left after their defeat in the West, a radical nationalist government took over, later to be overthrown by the Bolsheviks. In addition, like today, there were a number of Western nations hovering around Ukraine, waiting to see who would get the choice bits of this heartland country. France, Britain, Poland, Romania, but especially the British were predominant, as Vernadsky himself indicated. But the Academy lived on through this political turmoil, as did Ukraine, which then became a part of the Soviet Union. Vernadsky also brought in people from the Russian Academy to help with the organization of the Ukrainian Academy. And given the way that Ukrainians during the Russian Empire had been relegated to simple Ukrainian studies, the bulk of educated scientists were Russian. Vernadsky would use them initially while preparing Ukrainian aspirants that were beginning to come into the science fields and education. One can even say that the basis of Ukrainian nationhood had been laid by an individual who is the foremost representative of Russian science. If Ukraine could return to this tradition, it would help to undo the damage that has been done by the Anglo-American divide and conquer policy, which has pitted Ukraine against Russia in NATO's proxy war. The Ukrainian Academy lives today, as does the National Library of Ukraine, which still bears the name of Vernadsky. Vernadsky's picture, as far as I know, still graces the 1,000 hryvnia bill, the currency of Ukraine, although someone now proposed that he be replaced by the picture of the Ukrainian fascist icon, Stephan Bandera, another piece of insanity coming from a rather discombobulated nation. For us, this lesson must be to return to our own best traditions, which are also being subject to a similar cancel culture campaign that is similar to the one that has seriously disrupted the sanity of the Ukrainian nation. We had a Manhattan-style science program in the 1960s again, under John F. Kennedy, where the objective of sending a man to the moon and returning him to Earth became the single objective of our leaders, our educational system, and our scientific institutions. This created, in turn, a tremendous sense of optimism among the population. We have lost that, and we have suffered dearly because of it, and we can read the dismal results of that loss every day in our newspapers. But to achieve that today, we must reject the small-mindedness of our present political leaders. Other nations are following the same example. China in particular, most assuredly, and Russia even under oppressive conditions created by the West. If we try to cut off trade and to restrict the exchange of scientific information and conduct a policy of virtual technological apartheid against China and other nations that want to develop their own scientific capabilities, we violate everything that actually made America great. We must go back to the moon, but not as some imperial Colonel Blimp who hopes to plant the flag and conquer it for the motherland, but as a representative of humanity on the move in collaboration with other spacefaring nations, including China and Russia, with the aim of making all of mankind a spacefaring species. China has provided a geological map for exploiting the resources of the moon that we see here, thanks to the efforts of the head of the Institute of Geochemistry, Ouyang Zhiyuan, the father of China's Chang'e lunar program. And here we have two paintings, one a moon freighter painted by Kraft Erica, and another one based on a drawing by Kraft, who was too ill with leukemia to finish it himself. So he sent it to a colleague of Lyndon LaRouche, Chris Sloan, to paint it. This is Selenopolis, Kraft's city on the moon. Let's get around to building it.
Thank you so much, Bill. Very inspiring. This concludes our presentations for today. 5 very interesting, inspiring presentations. The density of ideas is staggering. And now we want to bring up the panel for our question and answers. So who is coming onto the panel? Okay, they will turn the video on. But if you, maybe I can make a, okay, there we are. I see Sergei Pulinets, Francesco Battaglia, and we're waiting for Jason Ross and Bill Jones to come up. Unfortunately, as I have said, Ed Calabrese can unfortunately not be on. But okay, there we are. Excellent. So we are getting in some questions. Hello, everyone. It's been really inspiring. And I think we're going to have an equally inspiring discussion about this. So you can send your questions as they are coming in, but you can still send many questions. We're able to pick them up into questions@schillerinstitute.org. That is questions@schillerinstitute.org. But before I go and pick up some of the questions, I want to maybe ask for some comments on what some of the speakers have said. I think one was Jason, who said that evolution has a direction upwards, as you have argued. But this strikes at the very heart of the ecological movement and their pseudoscientists behind it, because they are basically oriented towards the movement downward. And this was very much popularized, as I remember and recall, by Herbert George Wells and, Time Machine, where basically you see his argument was that every civilization sort of has a zenith and then it goes down. And at the end, there are just some giant crabs and, there are just some giant crabs, and the sun is a red giant, and everybody has died out. So, I mean, you're going against this pessimist ideology. What do you think about this?
Well, thanks for the question. I think that there is an argument made that evolution doesn't have a direction, and that a worm today and the human species are equally well evolved simply because we both exist at present. Once we both find some niche in the biosphere today, we both had time to develop over millions of years, and therefore we're equally fit. Vernadsky himself presented a couple of metrics for looking at the direction of evolution and the change of evolution. And I'd mentioned those. A couple of these things are about the energy flow through individual organisms, as well as if we look at the change in the biosphere as a whole over time. So, one of the examples that Kraft Erika also points at for thinking about how major shifts occur in the biosphere is the creation of photosynthesis. So in terms of where organisms get their energy, it's thought that the first life on Earth simply ate chemicals or lived off of chemical energy. This still exists today with some things that live in the crust of the Earth, or especially we see these really amazing assortments of life that are found at the bottom of the ocean at these vents that are emitting sulfur-containing compounds and others that they're able to use for energy. But you compare that to the extraterrestrial energy source that powers essentially almost all of life on the planet today, the sun. Life uses an extraterrestrial power source. And the development of photosynthesis means that the quantity of life that can exist on the planet has increased, many, 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 many orders of magnitude by the ability to use sunlight. The total amount of biomass is increased because now you have the plants, things that eat the plants, and so on. And then we've seen concentrations of energy within the biosphere, including by our own doing. So like creation of fruit trees and breeding them to have more delicious and big fruits, the kinds of things that provide energy for animals that need a lot of it, birds and things like this. We've seen the amount of energy used over an organism's lifespan per gram of its mass. We've seen this change in shifts from older forms of life, or forms of life that developed and arose earlier, like reptiles, compared to mammals today. So really, the evolution isn't a random thing. It's not just the Darwinian idea of you have hereditary changes and then the survival of the fittest. I'm not saying that's totally wrong, but when you look at these kinds of major shifts that have occurred, there's a lot more than that, and it has a direction, just as our economic development has a direction. It has a place that we're heading. It's not just random motion, it's growth.
There's a question that is directly for Professor Battaglia in Trieste, and it comes from a leader of the Schiller Institute in Milan. Her name is Liliana Gorini, and she first of all, she says, "Thank you for your very clear presentation. I was wondering, was there ever any response to the open letter that you and hundreds of other Italian scientists sent to the Italian President Mattarella and other institutions on the fraud of climate change?"
Yes, thank you. Not at all. There was no response. Actually, that letter was sent not only to the Italian President Mattarella and to the Prime Minister at the time, who was Mr. Conte, but after all, that letter was translated into English by the Clintel group in, I think, in Holland was made as a letter to the Secretary of the United Nations and signed by 1,000 scientists. And the first signatories was Professor Ivar Gia-Evar, who is Nobel Prize in Physics. However, that letter was never got no response at all by anybody.
Well, maybe for a reason. I would like to direct a question to Professor Pulinets, which I will make up of two elements. One is my own, because you have shown us the impact and the magnitude of the global electric circuit and the impact it has on our, for example, weather patterns. This is something that is largely ignored by the so-called climate scientist group in the West. They are seeing basically, they're defining the Earth's system as a closed, like a goldfish bowl system. Maybe you can respond to that in the first part of your question. And there was also another question that says that you talked about cosmic rays, says Johnny Shreves, Shreves. But you didn't, I didn't hear you mention cosmic rays affecting volcanoes. I have heard that cosmic rays from the sun can cause volcanoes to erupt and spew volcanic ash into the atmosphere, blocking the sun and lowering temperatures. Have you ever heard of global solar minimum and global solar maximum, he asks.
Okay, I will start with your question. We should take into account the periodicity of the solar activity and following by that the periodicity of the galactic cosmic rays activity, because during the maximum and during the minimum of the solar activity, we have different pictures of the precipitation and weather at all. So in the creating the forecasts, we should take into account the space impact on our weather. In general, the meteorologists do not take into account the electromagnetic qualities of the different atmospheric formation, like hurricanes. During the development of hurricanes, we see the thunderstorm discharges. There are electric currents inside the hurricane. So we have the electric current moving through the geomagnetic field. So interaction of the electric current and geomagnetic field plays important role on the trajectory of the hurricanes. And the strong electric field in the top of the hurricane penetrates in the ionosphere and creates irregularities of electron concentration in the ionosphere. All these effects are not taken into account by the meteorologists. About the second question, no, I don't heard about the effects of the cosmic rays on the volcano eruption. There is some coupling between the solar geomagnetic activity and the seismic activity, but it is not a direct coupling. There are some doubts about this, and this question still is under discussion, but I do not neglect the possibility of the effects of the solar and geomagnetic activity on the seismic activity. Speaking about volcanoes, volcano is a secondary part of this, and probably it is has the similar effects, but I do not claim and cannot say that there is direct effect of the cosmic rays on the volcano activity.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I would
Can I
like to direct the next.
ask Sergey a question? I would just like to know if you could say anything with regard to the collaboration between Russian and Ukrainian scientists now today. How has that been affected? I mean, given the intensive campaign against Russia and Ukraine, how is that affecting that collaboration which has existed?
It is very difficult question. Actually, we had a very strong collaboration between the Russian and Ukrainian scientists. We had continuous exchange. For example, the Kiev University, Kharkov University, Space Agency of Ukraine, and Russian different kind of institutions and universities. They took part in our conferences. We participated in their conferences. We have the common publications. You can find them in the literature. But now the problem is very difficult because part of the Ukraine scientists are under the pressure and even accepted that ideology which is exhibited by the Ukraine government, and there was some cases and in communication between scientists that some Ukrainian scientists requested to punish Russian scientists for the intervention of Russia to the Ukraine, regardless that scientists has nothing to do with this. And now they are prohibited in Ukraine. Ukrainian scientists are prohibited to cooperate with Russia. We expect the finishing of this conflict to re-establish these relationships.
Well, there's one question that comes in about Vernadsky, but also LaRouche, and I would like to direct the question to Bill from Isa Martinez, and she says the following: records show that many of Vernadsky's groundbreaking ideas were utilized throughout history, but many scientists in the West failed to cite him by name, despite the fact that Russians and Ukrainians alike have historically celebrated him as a scientific genius. LaRouche faced similar hurdles throughout his career as a political forecaster, economist, and innovative thinker. What do these men have in common, and why has society drawn away from fully honoring them and their accomplishments?
Well, I think part of it is because of what the mainstream has become, which rejects more and more the notion of progress, especially with those with such a cosmic vision as LaRouche and Vernadsky. These were people who were looking, centuries back and centuries forward in designing policy for today. And the empiricists or the pragmatists don't really want to accept that kind of a vision. But there are different reasons for it. I mean, the problem that Lyndon LaRouche had was that the British Empire was still very much alive, and still very much alive here in the United States. And it was in particular his attacks against Britain and the consequent following of the United States in British footsteps in much of its foreign policy that got him into trouble at a time when he was actually an advisor to the president, effectively, over the SDI. With Vernadsky, it's a different question. I mean, there's on the one hand, there's an attempt to make him into a spiritualist and the noosphere into something mystic, which is a total misunderstanding of what he was doing. The other thing is the fact that his works are generally not available in English language. The reason that he is well known today in the United States, I would say, is because Lyndon LaRouche really adopted his policy and made him into a figure through LaRouche's political activity here in the U.S. But that actually, and Jason and I and others were involved on it, we translated Vernadsky's works and published it. And if you go on the internet today and you look up Vernadsky in English, you're going to find mostly our publications plus the classic view of the publication of the biosphere. But all the other stuff is not there. And I would like to relate that to what Professor Calabrese said with regard to science education, which I think was very important. He said, you don't go back to the latest thing has been written, but you go to the earliest and try and follow the progress of the ideas. And Lyndon LaRouche was insistent on this, that if you want to encourage creativity, which is the basis for scientific activity, it's not rote learning, you have to go through the process of the mind of the great thinkers. And that's also a question of both biography and history. And the reason that Vernadsky's works would be so important is not only because he dealt with so many different things in a very unique way, but you would go through the process of his own creativity. There were 5 books called Problems of Biogeochemistry. I think we translated 2 of them, which had to do with what Jason been talking about on the notion of time and space. There was a picture once of Vernadsky in the 1930s at a scientific conference. And on the one end, you had Vernadsky, on the other end, you had Albert Einstein. I don't know if they ever talked. They might not have, but those were really the 2 great figures of science in the last century. And that Vernadsky was inspired by Einstein's ideas. And he wrote about this in terms about, and it's not available except if you know Russian. His last work was The Chemical Structure of the Biosphere and Its Surroundings. And this is what, Professor Pulinets was talking about, but he wrote that in 1944. And if that would have been available, this would be a tremendous boon to scientists and young educators and young people who want to learn science, because they would be put right into the mainstream of science. The similar with LaRouche, but his writings are still very relevant today. And if you look at our webinars and what we're publishing and the republication that we're doing of LaRouche's works are very important today, even though he wrote it like 20 or 30 years ago, because he was looking so far beyond that it becomes relevant, for a long time. And this is the way that you counter what both of them have been faced with in terms of the attempt to limit the proliferation and the expansion of their ideas.
Well, LaRouche has always worked with young people, educating them and enlightening them to understand real science. As Professor Calabrese just said in his presentation, I'm old school, he said. I'm going back to the original sources. It's a double amount of work, but this brings you actually, and if you trace it to today, this brings you to the original discoveries. That was exactly LaRouche's method. Now, young people are, of course, they are exposed to the system and how it undermines science and uses it for their own benefit. And so we have a question which is very typical for young scientists that comes from a Venezuelan biologist by the name of Cesar. And I would like to address this just to all of the panel. I think everyone is involved in teaching and, working with young people. And the question is the following: technological scientific development today is largely used only by the elites to make money, not in order to develop our human race. And it is difficult for young scientists to develop science without being watched by interests seeking to steal any advance for their own benefit. Those of us who want to continue to develop our doctoral projects are even cut off and face the tough decision of having to abandon our work for lack of economic support. Now, he has 2 questions. How can a new world model be developed which supports science, which serves to develop humanity beyond individual development seeking to profit from it? And second, how can renewable energies and technologies such as nuclear energy be separated from their use as weapons instead of being an energy source for humanity. So anyone wants to start can raise his hand. Okay. Yeah, Francesco. You have to unmute yourself. We can't hear you.
Okay, sorry. I wouldn't be so pessimistic. I think that human beings know how to handle with science and how to make profit out of it. I mean, not only economic profit. So I would be more optimistic on this. Of course, not everything that man does is done right, but this is part of our nature. And second, we shouldn't think that to make profit is necessarily a bad thing. To make profit is okay, and this is eventually what human being aims to, because making profit means also to be richer, but not richer in terms of money, but rich in terms of our ability of living better. As for the separation of power and nuclear energy, everything comes out of technology, out of science, can be used in a good way or in a bad way. And this is something that we should be aware of for everything we can think of. This is up to us to make the best use of it. So I think this is what I would like to say on that questions.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else wants to respond?
Can I just add something? I just want to say that.
Okay, Bill, go ahead.
I just want to say that this idea of Vernadsky of the academy, that is having a Manhattan-style project where the government is supportive, to the decisions made to advance science, is absolutely essential today. I mean, that would resolve some of the problems here. You can't it can't be a laissez-faire policy of developing science. The United States has lived off of that since the end of the lunar program. And it doesn't really lead to very good results. And if we look at China, I mean, people criticizing them because they made such great advances so quickly. They adopted this policy. They adopted the policy that we had during that time. And if we got back to that, you would eliminate many of these problems where the competition of the so-called companies, which unfortunately is becoming more the case than less the case today, would be under the leadership of the national academy or the nation, which could see to it that everybody would be involved in this and benefit from it, and not be a matter of competition in the market.
So I'd like to take Sergey first, and then Jason.
I would like to answer on the second part of the question. It is very difficult to separate, especially in nuclear science, military applications and peace applications, because the development of the technology usually went in the way that inventions from military applications then are transferred to the peaceful application. And I would like to say that in Russia, there was a great problem with radioactive waste. What to do with this? It came from the production of the nuclear weapons, but finally it reached a very, very, very strong advance in the peaceful nuclear reactors, which are called reactors on the fast neutrons. The advantage of this that they can use any kind of nuclear waste, and in the output they have nothing radioactive. So it is the most promising type of the nuclear reactors and to produce the nuclear energy. So the decision or output depends on the intentions. If your government has a peaceful character, it will use these efforts of the scientists in the peaceful way. But to separate exactly military and peaceful, we don't have enough scientists to work separately in this field. Thank you.
Okay, Jason.
I'll add on. So on our Venezuelan friends' questions on the first part, I think that the issue of government direction for scientific progress, scientific investment, that's been addressed here. I think that's, the key thing there is about what are the goals of society? What are the economic goals that are put forward? If you have a free market approach, you are going to miss investments specifically in infrastructure and in long-term scientific progress, where the discovery of a fundamental law of nature isn't patentable, for example. So as we've seen with big projects like the Manhattan Project, like going to the moon, things like this, you simply require government investment, and this should be the focus. We're spending huge amounts of money on really asinine projects to make a windmill slightly better, this kind of thing, while people are fighting for dollars to make advancements in nuclear fusion, which is far more worthy of support. I mean, this is the goal of economics. What are the frontiers of science that are going to move things forward? On the issue of nuclear energy and nuclear weapons, I'd also like to look back to the Strategic Defense Initiative policy, what was announced as the Strategic Defense Initiative by Ronald Reagan in 1983. And this came from a proposal that LaRouche had made on not trying to ban nuclear weapons, which I respect the intent of people who want to have a world free of nuclear weapons. The way to do that isn't by legislating away nuclear weapons, which can't happen. What LaRouche said is, let's develop a new technology rather than trying to control one that already exists in that way. Let's develop a defense against nuclear weapons with new particle beams, with lasers, and this kind of thing. So that's one approach. The other approach is changing the governments, destroying geopolitics, so that there is not a fixed zero-sum game view of the world in which another's gain is your own loss. We need to put in place a system of cooperation, especially led by the US, Russia, China, India, others, towards adopting goals as a human society for progress, for the worldwide elimination of poverty, for big financing, for the real frontiers of science. We have to adopt goals of this sort. So I don't think there's a technological answer to that question. It's inherently a cultural and a social one.
Well, that's perfect. That brings me perfectly to the next question, which is from a gentleman called Frank Sch. And it's a longer question, but it also deals with the aspect of educating young people and the culture of science. And he says the following: how do we inspire the young people in North America and Europe to be interested in science and engineering as they were in the past and as they are now in China, he says. There was a recent survey where they found that the most popular dream jobs in the West, I suppose, for children were, in that order, YouTuber/vlogger, teacher, then athlete, then musician, then astronaut. This is in contrast to China, where the most popular dream jobs were in order: astronaut, teacher, musician, athlete, and then YouTuber or vlogger. The panel had brought up several possible problems, such as lack of resources in scientific and technological education, the promotion of a pessimistic outlook of humanity as polluters and as mere animals of the planet, among other problems. I would also like to point out that well-paying jobs in the tech industry are usually for software, for companies such as Facebook, Google, and Amazon, or in finances, as opposed to physical engineering? What does the panel think we can immediately do on a policy and cultural level to advance the interest of productive STEM culture, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, in our societies? So this goes to the panel, and I'll go by the hands that are risen in that order. So who would like to go first? Jason, okay, go ahead.
Sure, we all want to speak on this one. Well, so, in the US, one thing would be to not do, there's some really insane attempts at education reform right now. One of the most notable is, for example, the California math curriculum reform, which is not about math so much as seeking equity and things like this. This would remove advanced classes from schools in the name of making sure that people don't have too much divergence in their math classes or their tracking. This is like idiotic. This is saying, hey, math isn't really the issue here. Science isn't really the issue here. So don't do things like that. In terms of really making a fun and enlivening STEM curriculum, I think if we look again to what Professor Calabrese had said, where he said in his field, what he would enjoy doing was going back to the original studies, the original works, formulating in his own mind what experiments he think would make sense as follow-ups on that. He'd often find that those weren't what was done and a different path was pursued, but that you need to look at the origins of things. And I know that the educational curricula developed by Lyndon LaRouche, the LaRouche movement, and what I think makes sense would be to have a lot more going through the original works. So take a curriculum and make the focus not understanding the application of formulas, which I'm not saying they're wrong, but being able to do engineering effectively is not exactly the same pursuit as a development of scientific capacity. That is, the ability to come up with new hypotheses, to find where the problems lie in current understanding. And that's really what should be done in school. That's tough. It requires more teachers for a number of pupils. But I think it's just overall a different approach that's actually fun. So, do kids rediscover for themselves the Pythagorean theorem, or do they just use it? Do people hear that Kepler has 3 laws and that planets move a certain way, or do they work through Kepler's well laid out book, where you get to work through with him his discovery? And I know from teaching this way that the kind of fun, camaraderie, sense of each other's creativity and ability to discover that comes among the pupils in that kind of educational environment it does something much more than pound into people the ability to do their math or physics homework right, which that would be a step up from where we are right now. But it really has a major social component as well. And it's fun. I mean, there's a real sense of, I think, love of what it is that people are capable of doing, and a better understanding of the universality of people in general that comes from that. There's a lot of division about, what's your background, what's your identity, et cetera, et cetera. Our identity as human beings is our ability to discover. And I think we could be doing a lot more of coming to know that universality of that human distinction from the animals. There's a great opportunity to do that with all the years that are spent in school. And I think we should take that opportunity much more. Also, one other thing is having missions that put those skills to use. So during the Apollo program in the United States, when we were going to the moon, people went to school to study engineering. There was a clear mission. There was a goal there. There was a need for that kind of knowledge. And so if we have major goals on nuclear fusion, on space, things like that, I think that's the other direction of driving that kind of improvement in education.
Yeah. Bill, please, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to say that what's going on in the world as a whole, of course, is very much different than what we have going on here in the United States. And the big problem is that the US is closing itself off more and more to the rest of the world in an attempt to actually, remain the main hegemon. That has to do, for instance, with news coming from China, look, this could be inspiring. What the Chinese are doing on their space station could be very inspiring to Americans. And I know the Chinese embassy had one occasion where they invited schools to participate in Zoom and some at the embassy itself to talk with the Chinese astronauts who were on the space station. And people got very excited about it, but it's a very small group of people. Otherwise, you don't see anything about the Chinese space program on American television. You don't see the astronauts entering the new space station. And if they could see this, I mean, people know this. The intelligence services watch it very, very carefully because they're so frightened of this. But if it were made into a public phenomenon, if people could actually see what is going on in the rest of the world, they would again become excited about this, as the Chinese population are becoming excited about space exploration. But by trying to suppress it and not letting the general public know what's going on, you're creating a closed environment in which we continue along the same route that we have been going along, because the Chinese want to cooperate with the world. I showed this map of the geological picture of the moon, which is done by the Chinese. We didn't do it. We didn't know all the geological information that's there because we didn't have people studying it as intensively as Ouyang Ziyuan and his team, which modeled their institution on Vernadsky's biogeochemical laboratory. And so that they could present that. That should be an inspiration of people, of what the moon really has to offer. But again, that is not known because we're not going to talk to the Chinese because they're bad people. And that's the biggest problem. I mean, both the Russians and the Chinese are going to recover from the crisis that we have now. If we could open the doors again to the world, we would see that there are exciting things going on, and people would get excited about being a part of that.
Exactly. So Jason is just out for a minute. He will come back. But yes, well, science is universal. I can advise the viewers to watch female Chinese astronaut Wang Yaping's so-called science lectures, which she gave 2 from the earlier Chinese space station and from the new one. And I think she had an audience of 60 million students and teachers in China. And you can watch it with English subtitles. So you'll be very inspired because it poses some questions. How do you measure weight in microgravity? A simple question, but it's a real challenge for the mind and how it thinks. So this brings me to one question which is directed to Professor Battaglia and one for Professor Pulinets. And it comes from someone called Cal Smith. And he says the following: my wife and I recently returned. Oh, by the way, you can send in your questions as we are speaking at questions. The email is questions@schillerinstitute.org. Questions@schillerinstitute.org. As they're coming in live, I can pick them up. We still have some time. So, okay, Cal Smith says, my wife and I recently returned from Napoli, Italia, where I had worked for a year. There was an abandoned nuclear power plant not far from our home near Lago Patria. So question number 1 is for Professor Battaglia. What potential exists in Italy to revive the attempted nuclear power industry? What was the role of the European Union in shutting down Italy's nuclear power industry? And question number 2 is for Dr. Pulinets. What additional work have you done on precursors of earthquakes and volcanism? Maybe in that order.
Yes. Well, I think for the time being, I think for a few years, it's very difficult for that Italy will return to go back to the to nuclear power, because there were been 2 referendums in Italy. One was right the year after the Chernobyl accident. And with that referendum, it was politically interpreted as to be against nuclear power, although it's not possible in Italy to have a referendum pro or against nuclear power because it's against constitution. However, politically, the referendum was interpreted in that way. And then we had another, there was back in 2010, the government at the time was Prime Minister Mr. Berlusconi, and he wanted to revive nuclear power in Italy. However, during that time, there was the Fukushima accident in Japan, which was interpreted that accident as a nuclear accident. Actually, there were 1,000 people because of the earthquake, but nobody even had a cold from the radiation that came out from the Fukushima reactor. However, Italy had another referendum at that time, and because of the Fukushima accident, Italians gave their vote against nuclear power again. And it was quite strange because the only country all over the world that shut down with nuclear power after Chernobyl and after Fukushima was only Italy. After Chernobyl, in Ukraine, there were 9 nuclear reactors, new nuclear reactor, and Japan is coming back again to repower with nuclear energy. So the Italian situation is quite strange. The question actually suggests that there has been some influence from other European countries so that nuclear power would not be part of Italy energy production. This could be. I don't really know what kind of influence from abroad have been against nuclear power in Italy. So, but I think that eventually, Italy has to rethink its energy policy. Because at the time being, it's quite a failure.
Sergey, do you have the question in your mind still? Oh, okay.
Yes. Can I share the screen instead of answer the question? I am trying to do this. This one. Do you see?
I just see a black screen right now. I don't know if the technical staff is prepared for showing it.
Once more.
Okay, try again. It's just black right now. We can still hear you, but we see nothing.
Screen, this me, yes. And how to this one. No, yes? Okay.
No, we don't see your screen. Oh, we don't see your slide. Unfortunately.
Wait a minute. Once, finally.
Okay.
This one. Okay?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, so regarding what I'm doing, I'm showing 2 monographs, 2 books. One was green, which is green, was published in 2018 in Institute of Physics in Great Britain. And you see the name, The Possibility of Earthquake Forecast and Learning from Nature. and it book was written in co-authorship with Dimitar Rozunov from United States. And the second book, it is already in Amazon, but it is not physically published. They promised to be published in July this year. So earthquake precursors in the atmosphere and ionosphere, new concepts. It will be published by Springer, and we put there our latest results on the possibilities of the earthquake forecasting, especially with the help of space technology applied to the registering the precursors in atmosphere and ionosphere. So if you can send me email from this person who put the question, and I can send him the link to majority of my publications in PDF, he will be able to download. This is my answer.
Okay. Okay, we'll make sure that Cal Smith gets access to these publications. We do have a question that is related to Mr. LaRouche, who was a universal scientist, not just economics. He was interested in all fields of science. And his relationship or collaboration with the Russian Academy of Sciences. The question is, can you describe or elucidate LaRouche's influence and collaboration with the Russian Academy of Sciences, and what caused him to be admitted to the Russian Academy of Sciences? This question comes from Amber Smith, who is the Director of Communications for Diane Sayre's Senate campaign. So anyone wants to start?
Well,
okay, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think it was obvious that why he was elected, because they immediately recognized the quality of his ideas, the quality of his mind, and it's not unusual that they did. I mean, he was also recognized by people here, but he was under an intensive campaign. Millions of dollars essentially were spent to really paint him as a criminal or a wacko or whatever. And but in Russia, that was not the case. So that they looked at the ideas and they saw complementary ideas to many of the things that had been already expressed in Russian culture, in particular, the ideas of Vernadsky. And one of his strongest supporters, Pobis Kuznetsov, who actually was the one that said that that LaRouche's definition of economic development in terms of increasing energy flux density should be called the law in honor of LaRouche. Pobis was also on the commission in Russia to investigate the heritage of Vernadsky. So the climate, I mean, that there was a greater understanding of what he was actually saying among Russian intellectuals than, unfortunately, many of the American intellectuals who, tended to be much more pragmatic and didn't have the long-term vision of LaRouche. So I think that was quite an obvious thing. And politically, of course, he was favorable to U.S.-Russia relations, and he was working really as a back channel for the Clinton administration, or one part of the Clinton administration, to try and improve relations with Russia in the 1990s. And of course, that was sabotaged by Al Gore, who unfortunately became the point person in Russian policy for Clinton, so that LaRouche's influence was not as great. But that's what he was doing in Russia. He was doing that not as a private citizen, but he was doing that as a representative of the United States. But it was really the power of his ideas that led to his being elected in the academy.
Sergei Pulinets, do you know anything, another aspect of this?
I met Lyndon and Sergey LaRouche in a few conferences which were organized by the Schiller Institute, and I start to know about their activity and ideas only from these conferences. But after that, I was looking what is with ideas of LaRouche in Russia. I know that they were making conference in Dubna University, and mainly politics and part from the of this humanitarian part of the Russian Academy of Sciences was involved in this cooperation with Lyndon and LaRouche. That's all I know from my side.
Well, thank you very much. And for those of you who are not familiar with Lyndon LaRouche's works, there's an opportunity to purchase his, or the first 2 volumes of his collected works. I think they're being edited continuously. When they're finished, there'll be probably 100 or 200 volumes. But you can order them. I think you can send us an email on the Schiller Institute website and we'll forward you to the relevant department. Mr. LaRouche passed away in 2019. His birthday was in 1922, so I think on September 22nd of this year will be his 100th anniversary. So stay tuned also to a conference or some of our activities. Now, I would like to bring up a question which has been contended for decades, which is the fusion energy. We've talked about this, and also LaRouche has established the Fusion Energy Foundation and the Fusion Magazine, and I think it's very fitting to ask the following question from a person called Corky Goss, and he, I'm sorry, I don't know what Corky refers to, he or she, says, is the Schiller Institute aware of the continuing work on cold fusion? Ball lightning physics carried out by Russians and others. For example, the Sapphire project is far ahead of the ITER, which is the joint plasma project in Cadarache in France. Warm regards, Corky. So who wants to answer this question or go into it? Jason, maybe? You look like you have something on the tip of your tongue.
Well, I can say a bit. I mean, I think that there is, our understanding of the nucleus is not complete, and it's, sorry, I thought it would be quiet out here. I'm not at home. The potential and the existence of low energy nuclear reactions, I think, is something that definitely deserves more research. And I think it's exciting that there are projects that are looking into the possibility of there being aspects of nuclear transformations that we don't fully understand yet. And then that kind of work should continue. But I don't have a specific piece of feedback on the Sapphire project.
Professor Pulinets, do you know anything about this?
About nuclear fusion, you know that Russia participates probably in all projects regarding the nuclear fusion. I spent, how to say, more than 30 years in city of scientific city of Troitsk, where was and still exists the Trinity Institution, which worked he is a part of the Kurchatov institution, who worked actively in creating of the tokamak, and there are a lot of activity on the tokamaks and laser heating of the plasma and so on. But I personally do not participate in this. I know only that the periods of enthusiasm and opposite side changed year by year, and still it is not clear when the really the long-term trapping of the hot plasma will happen, which will start the nuclear reactor activity in real life. This is the first part. And the second part about the ball lightning. Just again returning to the Troitsk, the first institute, scientific institute there is Institute of Terrestrial Magnetism, Ionosphere and Radio Wave Propagation, which works in the radio physics. And my last years of working in this institute was I was a deputy director of Izmiran, it is called in like abbreviation. And there was Professor Stakhanov, who wrote the book about the ball lightning. He passed away very early, but it opened the way to study the ball lightning. And there now is the large community studying the ball lightning, and I participate from time to time the specific seminars in Moscow University about the ball lightning. The seminar has named the ball lightning seminar, and they have demonstrate many experimental results of registering of ball lightning. There are some active experiments to generate artificial ball lightning. So it is full life of this problem in Russia, but still not final answer on the physical mechanism of the ball lightning generation. That's all.
I wanted to ask Bill if you know anything about what the Chinese are doing in fusion energy. What I heard is they want to have this technology applicable.
I heard that they achieved the longest time of keeping the hot plasma. So they have the largest progress in this resolving of this problem.
Do you have anything to add about this, Bill?
Yeah, no, that's exactly what the achievement that they have made. That they're putting money and energy into this. I mean, obviously, they made the decision a long time ago that this was going to be a major effort on their part. They're big in the ITER project. They have two projects, as I understand it, both at the Hefei Institute and also in Chengdu on nuclear fusion reactors. And of course, the whole space program, which is to mine on the moon, is also oriented towards mining helium, which would be a source for the fusion reactors. And that decision was made a long time ago, and it had a lot to do with Ouyang Ziyuan, who is the geologist who really pushed the space program at a very early stage. One time he was like the Wernher von Braun here in the U.S. in making it a public issue. And that is the orientation. They're going to the moon for the resources. One of the major resources is the helium, because they intend to have fusion energy by the time that they're at the point where they can start mining it. So it's big time with them.
I mean, yesterday we had a panel on the utter bankruptcy of the financial system, and that it has to be reorganized, and investments have to be turned towards breakthroughs in scientific research and not into speculation. And I have a question that goes in that direction, because there was a call issued by Schiller Institute President Helga LaRouche to collect thousands of signatures worldwide to mobilize for a new Bretton Woods conference to basically reorganize the financial system and get rid of the speculative casino. And Renee Segerson suggests that we also bring in this aspect. Basically, she says that document, the proposal that we are making in the Schiller Institute, should reference the destructive effect of the dictatorial imposition of the fairy tale of global warming and CO2 paranoia as scientific ideas, and demand as a component of the reorganization of the financial system that a worldwide debate on that matter be opened up. After all, the question of where investment goes in industry and science is where the rubber hits the road. Perhaps we should direct this efficient approach to Helga as an idea. What do the panelists think? We have 3 panelists left. Francesco Battaglia had to leave, unfortunately, for personal reasons, but there we are.
Yes, may I say a few words?
Please, please, of course, go ahead.
You can observe recently that Russia started to transform the financial system, as you know, to making the Russian ruble, like a most reliable currency now, and keeping growing. And the background of this is the financial system should be loaned on the resources and material industry rather than some services which it is not have the real results in the real product. And probably to transform the system from the banking to the industrial finances will transform, and the first steps are done already.
Okay, anyone else? Jason, go ahead.
Yeah, you can't, as far as making a new Bretton Woods, a new financial architecture for the world, you do have to choose goals for what that development will look like. And I think that having an anti-Malthusian or anti-green, in the sense of the green pseudo-religious ideology as a component of that, makes sense, because the same networks that promote warfare, the encirclement of Russia and China, the geopolitical confrontation with those countries, these are the same networks with enormous, or at least with enormous overlap with London, the city of London, Wall Street, Washington, NATO, between economic financialization, which we've seen, really destroy the physical economic productivity while increasingly financializing it, the green anti-human Malthusian ideology, which uses claims of global warming and catastrophic changes and so on, usually presented without the context of what it would take to protect humanity, even if these changes were to occur. It's sort of a religious belief that change is bad. So the financialization of the economy, the green ideology, and warfare, especially regarding Russia and China, these are basically all 3 sides of the same intent. And it's important to recognize that, because you can absolutely shoot yourself in the foot if you say, hey, we need a new world system. What we have right now is unjust. It's not oriented around development, around eliminating poverty. But if you then lock yourself into a green outlook, you are not going to be able to achieve those goals. So I think that makes sense to consider as part of that perspective of what a new system is that we need.
Yeah, let me just add on to that, one thing, that if you have a new Bretton Woods conference, the idea, it should be different than the old Bretton Woods in one sense. And you have to institute this notion that President Xi has been calling the win-win cooperation, because each nation has different requirements and different needs, and they are sovereign nations, and they would come together in this kind of a conference. And it can't be decided. You can't figure out initially, you can set the goals for where the world should go, but then you have to take consideration to the individual problems that exist within each nation. And they're much different. They're much different because of culture and other requirements. So you have to find a principle which will bring everybody together. And I think this idea of the win-win cooperation or the community of a shared future should be the basis for any kind of discussions of this nature in order to be able to incorporate all the various needs of each of the individual countries. And I think they will make the decision in that terms of what benefits their populations. This is the second criteria that had been pointed out by Xi, is the people-centeredness of the decisions that are being made must also be a requirement for any kind of a discussion. And of course, he has made the proposal for the Global Development Initiative that has been accepted by the United Nations. So that could be a format for beginning to talk about the Bretton Woods, the idea of a new Bretton Woods system in the context of how do we actually develop the world as a whole toward this global development initiative.
I have several questions that are directed towards Jason, so maybe I can pick at least one of them up from Linda Everett. She says, decades back, you interviewed many international scientists presenting their research in all fields of science, from the cooperative effort of many countries through satellites to predict storms, volcanic activity, and the danger of asteroids. No doubt, scientists are still working, but now possibly only in a controlled environment. Thus, the capacity to share and develop ideas is horrifically eclipsed. Please, would you address this?
Well, I might offer an amendment on the time frame there, about decades ago. But I think that conferences like this one are important for being able to bring together scientists and people from different backgrounds to have a sense of how these different fields of research can come together in advancing the aims of the human species together. And that with that intent being a clearer part of national policy overall, I think that we would end up with a lot more of that. There's a sort of a silo effect that occurs in academia where researchers become quite focused in a particular field and sometimes lose out on opportunities to present with colleagues working in other fields, or even people from different walks of life, with people who are involved in making policy or making economic decisions. And there's not enough of an understanding between these areas. So you have the trouble of economists who think in terms of money or GDP or this kind of figure, but don't have any real understanding of science from the inside. That's a terrible problem. And then you also have scientists who could make great contributions towards these broader social issues, and who maybe simply aren't being asked, their opinions aren't being solicited. So I think that it comes again to the issue of mission for nations individually and for the international community through adopting broad, bold missions in science, in economics, for development, that I think we'll be able to get and drive a greater degree of collaboration. That would be something of great benefit.
You brought up the word mission. This is a perfect keyword for a question that came in from Pat Salisbury. And she says, there has been some discussion of the importance of defining science missions and looking into the great discoveries historically of scientists like Kepler to inspire youth. But we also have the image of Einstein playing his violin and his comments as to where his creative inspiration originated. Are there any lessons in that direction for us in our efforts to spark a renaissance? Sergei Pulinets, do you have any ideas about this?
What kind of renaissance do you mean? I cannot compare myself with Albert Einstein, but I can say that I compose the songs and poems, so it inspires me in my scientific work, and I know many physicists in Russia are doing this in the same way. Even in how to say, in 70s, there were discussions between physics and lyrics, and physics won because they were simultaneously physics and lyrics as well.
Okay, Bill, because that connection between poetry, classical music, and scientific discovery is something that also startles you.
Well, the issue is the aesthetic education problem. The famous educator Tsai Wen-pei, who traveled to Europe in the early 1900s, went to Germany, was educated there about 4 years, studied science, studied the development of philosophy and education, but also learned how to play the piano and learned how to play the violin. And neither the piano nor the violin were Chinese instruments to any extent. And he went back to China and became one of the Minister of Education under Sun Yat-sen, but that was a very short period. Sun was out. And he instituted what he called aesthetic education, because he said that he had learned also from the study of Schiller's writings, not to be ignored, that what he came across in Germany was the aesthetic letters, which he also, I believe, translated into Chinese, or had translated into Chinese, because he followed the view that if you want to cultivate a moral attitude in the individuals, it's through the concept of beauty, through striking the chords within that individual that represent, the highest strivings of the individual, the highest capacities of the individual mind. And so he said that, this should be a part of general education, whether you're going to study politics or history or science. You have to have an aesthetic background or an aesthetic base for doing that. You study a musical instrument, you sing. These were things that were going to become universal within the society, because they improve the moral character of the individual and they inspire the creativity. And I think that has to be this kind of a program of, any kind of Manhattan style program to push the STEM, has to be connected also to a program of aesthetic education that is open and maybe mandatory to some extent for everybody, which it is in China, because they realize the importance of this for inspiring creativity.
Okay, we should wrap up the panel 3, because this is a perfect transition to the last panel that is coming up in roughly an hour, because at 1 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, US time, or 7 p.m. Central European time, we will have a 4th panel, Classical Culture and the Dialogue of Civilizations, and there will be experts speaking from France, Brazil, Afghanistan, the United States, and the United Kingdom. So I'm really grateful for this very inspiring discussion. Thank you to Professor Pulinets in Moscow, to Bill Jones, and to Jason Ross in the US, and also thank you to Professor Battaglia in Italy and Professor Calabrese in the United States. Thank you for your contributions. I think this wraps up our panel 3. If you like what we are doing, dear audience, then help us get the message out, get these proceedings. The video will be archived. out to as many people as you possibly can, because this is the platform for a new paradigm. So help us build the movement, become a member of the Schiller Institute, subscribe to our publications and to our newsletter, and stay tuned. So thank you very much once again, and we'll see each other in 1 hour.